The house has felt strangely empty these past few days, even with the both of us here. It's as though the heartbreaks we're carrying have hollowed out the space around us. My brother, Ethan, and I have always been close, closer than most siblings, I suppose. We've been through everything together, and that's why it felt almost inevitable that we'd end up here, both mourning the end of relationships we thought would last forever. It started with me. I came home that evening feeling numb, like I was floating just outside my own body. I dropped my keys on the counter, the sound sharp and hollow in the silence, and collapsed onto the couch. I barely remember how I got the words out, but I managed to tell him. He ended it, I said, staring up at the ceiling, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. Ethan didn't say much. He just sat down next to me, letting me rest my head on his shoulder, like I used to when we were kids and the world felt like too much. The comfort of it, the familiarity, it nearly broke me. I don't think he realized how much I needed that, just to feel his steady presence next to me, reminding me that I wasn't completely alone. "It's okay," he murmured after a while, his voice soft. He's going through his own breakup too, though he hasn't said much about it. It was his decision, but I know it hurt him more than he's willing to admit. I've seen the way he drifts off, staring into nothing, as though he's trying to find a way out of his own thoughts. We sat there together, the sun dipping behind the horizon, painting the room in shades of gold and shadow. I could feel his arm tighten around me, a simple gesture, but it felt like everything I needed in that moment. I turned my face into his shoulder, breathing him in, and for a second, I felt a flicker of something different, something that made my heart beat just a little faster. Over the next few days, we slipped into a routine. Neither of us wanted to talk about what had happened. Instead, we filled the silence with old movies and takeout dinners, as though we were trying to distract ourselves from the empty spaces left behind by the people who were no longer in our lives. It was comforting, being together like this, leaning on each other without saying it out loud. One afternoon, we decided to go for a walk. The sky was a dull, steel gray, and the wind was picking up, carrying the scent of rain. I was telling Ethan some silly story from when we were kids, laughing at the memory, when I noticed the way he was looking at me. It wasn't just his usual protective glance. It was something else, something I couldn't quite place. His gaze lingered on me, warm and intense, like he was seeing me in a way he never had before. "What?" I asked, smiling even as a nervous flutter ran through me. "Nothing," he said quickly, looking away. It's good to see you smile again." I slipped my arm through his, leaning my head against his shoulder. It was a gesture I'd done 1,000 times before, but this time it felt different. There was a flutter in my chest, a feeling I couldn't ignore, no matter how much I tried to convince myself it was nothing. The days blurred together after that, the comfort of our shared company becoming something I started to crave. One night, after we'd finished a bottle of wine, we ended up on the couch, laughing about something ridiculous. It felt good, like we were the only two people in the world who could still find joy in the small things. Then the laughter faded, and I found myself looking at him, really looking at him. I realized how close we were sitting, our knees touching, his hand resting just inches from mine. The room felt charged, like the air before a storm. I could barely breathe, my heart pounding in my chest. "Do you think we're weird?" I blurted out, surprising even myself. Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" "This," I said, gesturing between us. "The way we've been. It feels different, doesn't it?" He didn't answer right away. When he finally nodded, the look in his eyes was one I'd never seen before, vulnerable, almost afraid. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It does." Before I could think it through, before I could stop myself, I leaned in and kissed him. It was the softest touch, barely more than a brush of my lips against his, but it felt like I'd crossed an invisible line. I half expected him to pull away, to laugh it off, or say something to break the tension. But he didn't. Instead, he kissed me back, deepening it, his hand sliding into my hair as though he'd been waiting for this moment as long as I had. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathing hard. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my whole body trembling. I searched his eyes for some kind of answer, some reassurance that we hadn't just made the biggest mistake of our lives. "What are we doing?" I whispered, barely able to get the words out. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. But I don't want to stop. I knew then that we'd just crossed a boundary we couldn't uncross. And yet, as I leaned in again, feeling his arms wrap around me, I realized that maybe I didn't want to. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I lay there in my room, staring at the ceiling, the kiss replaying in my mind like a movie stuck on a loop. I could still feel the warmth of his lips, the way his hand tangled in my hair, holding me close as though he was afraid to let go. It had been gentle, almost tender, but the emotion behind it was like nothing I'd ever felt before. What was I supposed to do now? In the dim light of early morning, I rolled onto my side and pulled the covers over my head, hoping I could hide from the truth of what had happened. But I couldn't escape the flutter in my chest, the way my heart seemed to race every time I thought about him. Ethan. My brother. I'd kissed my brother, and worse, I'd liked it. No, I'd wanted it. I hadn't felt anything like that in a long time. Not with Alex, not with anyone. It was terrifying. The house was quiet when I finally dragged myself out of bed. I took a deep breath, bracing myself before stepping into the hallway. Ethan's door was slightly ajar, and I could see a sliver of his room, the unmade bed, the morning light casting soft shadows across the floor. For a moment, I thought about knocking, about going inside and talking to him. But what would I even say? Sorry I kissed you? I regretted it, but that would be a lie. Or maybe I could confess that I wanted to do it again. No, I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I tiptoed downstairs and made myself a cup of coffee, trying to shake off the heavy fog of uncertainty. I was staring into the dark liquid, willing it to give me answers, when I heard him behind me. Morning, he said, his voice rough with sleep. He was standing in the doorway, his hair a mess, and the look in his eyes told me he'd spent the night the same way I had awake, thinking about what we'd done. I forced a smile, even though my heart was racing. Morning. We stood there, staring at each other, the tension from last night still lingering like a heavy cloud in the air. I watched as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his hand rubbing the back of his neck, something he did when he was nervous. It made me want to reach out and touch him, to smooth down his hair and tell him it was okay. But I didn't. I couldn't. So, he started, his voice trailing off. He took a step closer, and I could see the hesitation in his eyes. Are we going to talk about it? I swallowed hard, feeling the room shrink around us. I don't know what there is to talk about, I said, though even as the words left my mouth I knew they were a lie. There was so much to say, and it terrified me. He gave me a sad smile, like he could see right through me. Ava, he said softly, stepping closer still. His hand reached out, and for a moment, I thought he was going to touch me. But then he stopped, his fingers curling into a fist at his side. You kissed me. I know, I whispered, barely able to get the words out. I didn't mean to. He raised an eyebrow, and I knew he didn't believe me. Didn't you? He asked, his voice gentle but probing. Because I don't think I believe that. And I don't think you do either. I bit my lip, looking away. He was right. Of course he was right. I couldn't pretend it hadn't meant anything, that it was just a mistake. It had felt like the most real thing I'd experienced in months, maybe even years. I don't know what I'm feeling, I admitted, my voice small. It's all so confusing. Yeah, he agreed, and I could hear the pain in his voice. He took a deep breath, stepping back, as though he needed to put some space between us. It is confusing, but we can't ignore it, Ava. I don't want to ignore it. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, and I hated how vulnerable I felt, standing there in front of him, exposed and raw. What are you saying? I asked, my voice trembling. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the fear in his eyes too. I'm saying that maybe this, he gestured between us, maybe this is something more than just us being sad and lonely. Maybe it's something real. I opened my mouth to respond, but I couldn't find the words. How could I explain the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me? The guilt, the fear, but also the undeniable pull I felt towards him, like gravity drawing me in, no matter how hard I tried to resist. He took another step closer, and this time he did touch me. His hand found mine, his fingers curling around mine, warm and steady. Ava, he said softly, squeezing my hand. I need to know if you feel it too. If you don't, then I'll walk away. I'll pretend this never happened. But if you do, his voice trailed off, and I could see the hope in his eyes, fragile and tentative. I couldn't lie to him. Not to Ethan. Not when he was looking at me like that, like I was the only thing in the world that mattered. I nodded slowly, tears slipping down my cheeks. I do, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I feel it too. He pulled me into his arms then, holding me tight, and I let myself sink into the warmth of his embrace. It felt like coming home, like finding something I hadn't even realized I'd lost. His lips brushed against my temple, soft and hesitant, and I felt my breath hitch, a shiver running down my spine. What are we going to do? I asked, my voice muffled against his chest. I don't know, he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. But we'll figure it out. Together. I pulled back just enough to look up at him, searching his face for answers I knew he didn't have. But there was something in his eyes, something steady and certain, that made me believe we could find our way through this, no matter how messy or complicated it got. And then he kissed me again, and this time I didn't hesitate. I kissed him back, letting myself get lost in the moment, in the feeling of his lips against mine. It was soft and slow, a promise of something neither of us fully understood yet, but were both willing to explore. As we pulled apart, breathless and trembling, I knew one thing for sure. We had crossed a line, and there was no going back. But for the first time in weeks, maybe months, I felt a spark of hope. Maybe this was the beginning of something new, something unexpected but real. And maybe that was okay. For the rest of the day, the house felt different. It wasn't the same empty silence we'd been drowning in since our breakups. It felt charged, alive, like the air after a storm, when everything is fresh but the ground is still soaked. Ethan and I didn't say much, but we didn't need to. Every glance, every brush of his hand against mine as we passed in the hallway, spoke volumes. We had crossed a line, and neither of us wanted to pretend otherwise. I spent most of the afternoon trying to keep busy. I folded laundry that didn't need folding, rearranged the books on the shelf, and cleaned the kitchen twice. But no matter what I did, my mind kept drifting back to him, to the way he'd kissed me, the way his arms felt around me. It was like nothing I'd ever experienced, and it scared me as much as it thrilled me. By evening, I was exhausted from the mental gymnastics, the back and forth of my own emotions. I found myself standing in the doorway of his room, hesitating, wondering if I should go in or if I should turn back and pretend that everything was still normal between us. But it wasn't normal. It couldn't be, not anymore. He looked up when he saw me, his eyes softening in a way that made my heart clench. "Hey," he said quietly. "Hey," I replied, stepping inside and closing the door behind me. I leaned against it, hugging myself as if I could hold everything together if I just squeezed hard enough. "What are we doing, Ethan?" He let out a long breath, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I don't think we can ignore it." I took a step closer, feeling the pull between us like a magnet. "But it's wrong," I whispered, my voice shaking. "We shouldn't feel like this." "Maybe," he said, standing up and crossing the room until he was right in front of me. He reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering against my cheek. "Or maybe it's just different. And maybe that's okay." I swallowed hard, looking up into his eyes. There was so much vulnerability there, so much hope. It was like he was baring his soul to me, offering me a piece of himself that no one else had ever seen. I knew I should push him away, draw a line before we went too far. But I couldn't. I didn't want to. "I'm scared," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Me too," he said, his thumb brushing against my cheek. "But I'd rather be scared with you than safe and alone." And just like that, I was in his arms again. He held me tight, as if he could shield me from all the doubts and fears swirling in my mind. I buried my face in his neck, breathing him in, letting myself melt into his warmth. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could finally breathe. "Stay with me tonight," he murmured, his lips against my hair. It wasn't a demand, just a quiet plea, and I knew he needed this as much as I did. I nodded, pulling back just enough to look at him. "Okay," I said, the word heavy with everything it implied. We moved to the bed, slipping under the covers together. It felt strange at first, lying there side by side, our bodies pressed close. I could feel his heartbeat against my back, a steady rhythm that seemed to calm the storm inside me. He wrapped an arm around my waist, pulling me closer, and I relaxed into him, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. We lay like that for a long time, neither of us speaking. It was peaceful, a kind of quiet I hadn't felt in a long time. His hand rested on my stomach, his fingers tracing light, soothing patterns against my skin. I closed my eyes, feeling the rise and fall of his chest, the warmth of his breath against the back of my neck. "Do you remember when we were kids?" he whispered suddenly, his voice low, almost like he was afraid to break the spell, "and we'd sneak into each other's rooms when we had nightmares?" I smiled, nodding. "Yeah, Mom used to find us in the morning, curled up together like puppies." He chuckled softly. "She never scolded us. She'd just smile and tell us we were each other's best comfort." I felt a pang of nostalgia, mixed with a bittersweet ache. "We were, weren't we?" "We still are," he said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. He turned me gently, so I was facing him, his eyes searching mine. "You're still my best comfort, Ava. You always have been." I felt tears welling up, but I blinked them back, not wanting to cry again. Instead, I leaned in, pressing my forehead against his. "I feel the same way," I whispered. "I don't know what this is or where it's going, but I don't want to lose you." "You won't," he promised, cupping my cheek in his hand. "No matter what happens, you won't lose me." We stayed like that, wrapped up in each other, as the night wore on. It felt like the world outside had disappeared, leaving just the two of us, suspended in this fragile, stolen moment. I knew it couldn't last forever, but for now it was enough. At some point, I must have drifted off to sleep, because when I woke up, it was still dark outside, the room filled with the soft sounds of his breathing. I shifted slightly, and he stirred, tightening his grip on me. "Hey," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "You okay?" "Yeah," I whispered, my fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "I'm okay." He kissed my forehead, a gentle, lingering kiss that made my heart ache with something I couldn't name. "Go back to sleep," he murmured. "I've got you." And for the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself believe it. I closed my eyes, feeling the steady beat of his heart against mine, and let sleep pull me under, wrapped in the warmth of his arms, safe in a way I hadn't felt in a long, long time. When morning came, I knew the real world would crash back in, full of questions and doubts and the weight of everything we'd done. But for now, in this quiet cocoon of dawn, it was just us. And that was enough.